Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and down here on the bench you can see I've got a few things set aside that I'm going to use to feed my worm bins. It's just some stuff out of the freezer, some food scraps from the kitchen, as well as some used coffee. And other things down here are just some cardboard, paper tubes, cardboard tubes, and a little bit of crushed eggshell for grit. So on this little board here, I've got a quick description of what my game plan is for today. Oh, look at that. A huge amount of lens flare on that lens of the camera, so it's a shame. Maybe I have to start using some sort of a little hood to try to reduce that a little bit, but whatever. There is a big white splotch kind of obscuring the view of what I've written here, but I think it's still legible. Basically, I'm going to be targeting not the bins up top. The bins up top are my older Red Wiggler bins, and there's 36 days of age between those two. It's only been 5 days since they were fed, so they're not due for feeding yet. But the same way it's been 5 days since they were fed, they were both fed on the same day. My two newest Red Wiggler bins down here on the lower shelf, not the middle one. The middle one are the African night crawlers, but the two outer bins that you see down here on the shelf are my two newer Red Wiggler bins, and one of them is now 37 days of age, and the new one's only 5 days of age, putting them 32 days apart. So kind of the same way the 36 days apart applied to the two older of my Red Wiggler bins, I'm going to start doing that to the two newest of my Red Wiggler bins, and try to start managing the two new Red Wiggler bins very similar to each other, just so I can start treating them as sort of sister bins, just like I normally do with other bins that I sort of pair up this way. So I just figured I'd really quickly go over what my game plan was here for today. So before getting started, I just figured I'd give everyone a quick outline as to what my game plan for today was and why I'm doing it. So let's go into those bins up here and get started. So I think we're going to begin with the 5-day-old bin here. I've not checked in on it since I originally launched it with the worms 5 days ago. So I'm curious to see how things are progressing. This will be its according to my record keeping, this will be its second feeding, because I do treat the food that was placed into the bin when I originally built it as feeding number 1. So even though it's only 5 days old, this is already coming across as feeding number 2. And this is pretty common sight. You see when I place this paper down right beneath the plastic, all the moisture that would normally evaporate out of the bin gets caught on the plastic and then drops right down onto the paper below. So the worms come up to hang out and take advantage of that moisture. You can already see that they're depositing castings on the paper as well. But they're obviously not fond of the bright lights overhead, so they're all trying to squirm out of view here. So let's see if we can evict these little guys and let them get out of the bright light while we do our work over here. So in time, since the worms are going to be attracted to the moisture on this piece of paper and they'll be hanging out here a lot, the paper will eventually get deteriorated by them nibbling away at it. But since it's only been 5 days, the paper's still holding up quite nicely. But I'm sure it won't be that way for very long. So now the worms were dropped right into the middle when they were released into this bin. And the food that was placed in here when I originally built the bin would have been in all different places. When I build a new bin, I scatter the food all over the place. So I wouldn't really expect to find worms concentrated in any one particular location. I would expect to find them in various different spots all throughout the bin. So I guess we could take a little peek here and there and see what kind of stuff we can see. It's like over here we're seeing some worms hanging out. Down here too, but like I said, no huge concentrations of worms anywhere. I'm sure there's some over here too. As long as it's my first time checking in on the bin, I am curious to see how things are looking. So the worms have made their way into all reaches of the bin, or so it would seem. Pretty much everywhere I look, I'm finding worms hanging out. And all the material's got a nice, cool, damp feeling to it. And that's thanks to the plastic that is resting over on the top of it. So whatever moisture I used to dampen the bedding materials when I built the bin, as well as whatever moisture came in with the food that I fed this bin with, that moisture's all been remaining in the bin, trying to help, keep the place nice and cozy for the inhabitants. So, the way I like to do usually, I'll open up a little crevice down the middle of the bin here. And some of the material that I'd like to use to cover up with, I'll kind of stack that up a little as well so I have it within reach. So we'll use some of this leafy stuff over here to cover up with when we're done feeding. Oh, right down the middle too, I guess. There would have been food placed in the middle too, so there's worms that are hanging out here too, but like I said, not in any sort of great concentration. It's a good number of worms because this bin would have been populated with what I estimate to be about 2,000 worms. There's a good number of worms in here, but I see bedding everywhere. I just don't see many signs of the food that was used to build the bin. That was one thing I noticed, and after 5 days, that's pretty surprising. You would normally expect to find at least small scraps of the food that was used to build the bin. But maybe not necessarily. It depends on what was used, I guess. If it was a very easy to eat and very palatable food item, they could have done away with it quite quickly, leaving pretty much no leftovers or scraps. So what I've got here in this tray is actually what I've set aside for both bins that are getting fed today. So we'll just scoop out half of this for this feeding, give it to these guys, and save the rest for the second bin. Well, it seems like some of these frozen food items have adhered to each other, so I'm trying to prevent the second batch from coming out, since we need to set that aside for the second bin that we're feeding. Pretty nice job. Just had to tear apart a couple things that were kind of sticking together because of the cold. But you can see here, I just took a used coffee filter. A lot of times I rinse them off, and I've got a whole stack of them down here in my wormery, but this was the one that I had removed from the coffee machine yesterday, and I didn't take any time to really clean it off. I just grabbed it the way it was and stacked up some food on it from the freezer. And you can see it's not too much. There's a few chunks of banana peel in here, even the stem of the banana peel in here. This would be an avocado, a chunk of an avocado, maybe a quarter of one. Who knows, cucumber, radish obviously, and the half of an apple. So it's not a huge amount of food, but it should be a good enough portion to sustain this population. And it seems like it came just in the nick of time, because I didn't really expect to see no leftovers from the food that was used to build the bin. But it's a good thing, I'm glad to see that. So in addition to the food that I just placed in there, I also count that the coffee filter as bedding, and here this tube, cardboard tube, paper tube, is also bedding material. So it is always kind of a good idea to include a fair bit of bedding along with the feedings. And I try to be more generous nowadays, because in the past it seems like I've always been kind of skimpy on the bedding. So I'm going to be doing my best to try to not be such a miser when it comes to that. And obviously when it comes to coffee, I definitely don't have to be a miser, because I've always got an ample supply of coffee here to feed the worms with. So I think we left about half of the container for the other bin as well, so it should be a pretty fair split. So let's get this thing covered up. I do believe that the other bin that we're feeding is also populated with about an equal number of worms, with about, I would estimate, approximately 2,000 worms in there too. So I would think that in that bin too, they should probably be ready for their next feeding. I believe that their last feeding was pretty generous, so we will see how that's coming along. But for the first feeding of this bin, I really like what I saw. I like how the worms are occupying pretty much the entire space throughout the bin. I like the moisture level that I'm observing. I thought I saw a couple flying insects cruising around on top of this paper when I first removed the plastic. So that's something I got to keep an eye on. I don't want to make my worm bins into little sanctuaries for flying insects. Although sometimes it happens. Sometimes it's just not avoidable. But it's certainly not something I want to promote or try to encourage. have happen down here in my wormery, because it is in my house. It's just the basement of my house, so I don't need flying insects cruising around here. So so now I've got feeding number 1 in my 5-day-old bin taken care of. Although technically, in my record keeping, this first feeding after the bin was launched actually counts as feeding number 2. So let's get the older of these 2 bins out here on the bench and get them fed as well. Okay, so now even though we knew it was feeding number 2 for the younger bin, I'm not sure how many feedings this bin has received. This could be feeding number 4 or 5, but I didn't make note of that in my little sketchboard there. I just noted the fact that it has been 7 days since this bin was last fed, and this reminds me, maybe I'll go back into that other bin that we just fed and apply one of these filters to indicate where we last fed, although there was a filter placed pretty much right in the middle too, so maybe we could just use that filter when we get back into there to, you know, as we go forward, continue marking where we last fed. Even though I usually feed down the middle, I just, more or less out of tradition, like to mark where I last fed as an indicator to myself, because maybe sometimes I'll start feeding on the outer edge, but typically in the beginning, in the early days of a bin, I'll feed down the middle. So after, you know, I don't know how many, 3 or 4 feedings down the middle in this bin, we would probably expect to find the majority of the worms in this bin down the middle. But before we go probing down the middle and opening up room for the new feeding, let's just take a quick look on the outer edges of the bin. Wow, it's really nice. So many castings. You know, for a bin that's only about a month old, it seems like a lot of the leafy matter and cardboard and whatever it is that was used as bedding in this bin was, for the most part, already transformed into castings. Although there's obviously, you know, plenty of it remaining, so I don't think we're in a dire situation here of not having enough bedding for them. But you hear, you know, a lot of people echoing the same sentiment out there, people that vermicompost. Most people would tend to agree that you can typically not really go wrong by having what would seem to be too much bedding, because I guess the idea that goes hand in hand with that is that you can't have too much bedding. It's always a good thing. Here I'm seeing a lot more of the leafy stuff, but just as good over here too. A whole bunch of casting material scattered around in between the leaves. So I always like to see how the outskirts of the bin are doing, to make sure that they're just as hospitable for the worms as the center area that receives all the attention with the fresh food and moisture. Because it's always been the outskirts of my bins that tends to dry out a little bit. But ever since I've been covering with plastic, as you saw in the beginning, the plastic just does a great job preventing the moisture from being lost to evaporation. So yeah, like I said, this bin is also occupied with what I estimate to be about 2,000 worms. But here, yeah, as we anticipated, we do see pretty good sized jumbles of them hanging out right down the middle, which is where the feeding was applied a week ago. So I'm already seeing some of the remnants of the material that was used as bedding last time. I had taken an egg carton and chopped up the cardboard that it's made up out of into little bits like this, and I had laid all that down as the bedding for this feeding. So I don't know, I see plenty of that bedding remaining, but I don't see too much other than these kernels of corn here and there, because that was obviously some of the food that they got last time, these corn kernels. I don't see much of anything else. So it would seem like they've done away with everything with the exception of the corn, which is kind of expected because the corn does take a little while for them to break down for whatever reason. And even worse is the corn cobs. If you put corn cobs into your bin, then you know, be prepared to wait, because it will take them a huge amount of time to break that down. And they will, so you shouldn't lose faith in the fact that your worms will break down your corn cobs, because they most certainly will. It's just a very time-consuming process, and you have to just be patient. I'm just really, looking at the worm population in this bin because my estimate for this has always been in the neighborhood of 2,000 worms, but as I look around, somehow I get this feeling like maybe there's more. But I could be mistaken. It could just be just a figment of my imagination. So it's neither here nor there. It doesn't really matter one way or another. I just find myself always kind of getting curious and can't seem to resist poking around and seeing how things are doing and trying to maybe read between the lines a little bit and see if I can interpret what's happening in here to make sure I'm getting that good feeling that things are being managed correctly. Basically looking for anything that might require attention or fixing, basically. Alrighty, let's get this feeding placed in here. What we could do is we could actually take this old coffee filter and throw it in here with this paper towel, or in this case, toilet paper tube. This will be some of the bedding that we include in today's feeding. But I guess we can use this brand new coffee filter, and you can see this one was actually rinsed off, so it came from my little collection over here on my shelf. And we'll use this as an indicator to show where we last fed, because the other one is getting a little bit beaten up. So we'll set that aside and we'll cover up right where we fed after we close up the feeding area. So now here we've got a whole pear, and it's frozen for the most part still, and I'm having a hard time breaking it. I thought I might be able to break it in half, but it doesn't matter. I don't necessarily have to. It'll do just fine the way it is. And the other things in here you see are like the peelings of mangoes, there's some raspberry, and all kinds of other yummy stuff. So we'll just top off this feeding the way we did the last one. We're going to apply some crushed eggshell for the worms as grit. And we'll give them what remains of this coffee. Yep, I think that was the bottom of it for the most part. Once again, it's a pretty good, generous helping of coffee. I'm going to try to spread it out here across the entire top. So that's a pretty good size feeding. It seemed at first like it wasn't that much, but I guess with that entire pear, that is a pretty good size morsel, although I would imagine that's probably going to get gobbled up pretty quickly. So once that thing thaws out, it's going to become quite mushy and soft and probably very easy for the worms to chew through. And I'll be curious to see how those tubes progress in here. I usually chop up my cardboard and my paper tubes into little rings, significantly increasing the surface area of them. Well, not significantly, but still, I'm just curious as to how the tubes are going to get broken down over time in these bins. All right, looks like my two newest red wiggler bins are both doing quite nicely. I can't complain. The only thing I'm thinking of is a lot of times I prefer not to have the castings touching the plastic that I used to cover up with directly. And I didn't really take too much care to set the leaves, the leafy matter that was scattered on top aside to cover up with later. But if possible, I prefer to kind of have semi-clean bedding materials scattered across the top so that the castings don't get all stuck to the plastic. So it's just so that I don't end up having to deal with such a mess the next time I come in here to work. Although over time, eventually the bin will end up being mostly castings, and at that point I'll typically use a piece of newspaper covering the entire top to try to keep the plastic sheet somewhat clean. But you can already see it's getting pretty soiled. So at some point, maybe on the next go around, I'll try to wipe off all those castings and then try protecting it from getting soiled further by laying down a piece of newspaper across the entire top of the material. But for now, I think we're in good shape here. So I'm going to leave it be, and we're done. So I'm going to put things away here and get everything cleaned up, but I'm not going to bore you with that because that's all humdrum work that nobody's interested in seeing. So before I shut the camera off, let me really quickly say thank you. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate your company, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Bye now.